Hi, this is Chris Hoy. Thank you for joining me today on Create with Chris. Super excited to share a brand new design that I just painted. It is packed with tips, tricks, and techniques that will blow your mind. Find out how to create beautiful roses, impressive lace, and delicious sweets with a vintage effect. So grab your brushes and let's get started. I always start with a multi-purpose sealer, put a light coat on, let it dry well, lightly sand it, and it will provide a satiny smooth surface. The paint will adhere well, and it will be extra kind and gentle to the brushes. I'm using a 3/4 inch oval wash. It has really soft bristles, easy to apply the medium smoothly, which will dry quickly and be easy to sand. Once that is applied, I'm starting out with 4 different colors. I want to create kind of a soft, moody background. I'm using light mocha, and I thought maybe I would base coat the entire surface first, but I was kind of playing around with it, and I thought maybe if I used that little bit darker background, it would create a richer result as the colors kind of blend in. So I'm adding light mocha here and there, not putting it on smooth and heavy, just light. Did not clean my brush. I just went into the spa blue, started a little bit to the bottom and worked it to the middle. If there's too much paint on the brush, it can be wiped off. I keep a paper towel handy. Let it blend together. I'm working quickly. I don't want the paint to dry before I go into the next layer. Because I'm using such a little amount of paint on my brush is slightly moist. It helps the paint to move around, and I can blend it in easier. If there's too much paint on the brush, it just becomes heavy and it's hard to get anything that looks soft and flowing. So this is the first coat. I'm just softly blending it in. Wipe excess paint off of my brush. Being careful not to bring the 3rd or 4th color is Laurel. Trying not to bring that over into the light side. Let it dry well. Now I can go back. I know basically where I want my colors to blend and where I want my light and dark. So adding the second layer, not only do I use less paint, but I can work quicker because I don't have to make any major decisions as to where to lay the paint, and just kind of let it blend softly. Again, wipe the brush if it becomes too heavy or solid. You want that to just blend and be very, very soft. A little bit of paint makes a big difference. I say that a lot. If you have trouble with open time and the paint becoming starting to tack up, go ahead and use a mister or a fast dry glazing medium. I'm using a stencil to add the lace on the side, and you can even use paper doilies. They work excellent. I did go with Adirondack white chalk paint. It's a little bit of a heavier bodied paint. It's a little bit more opaque. I'm not super patient, so using this will really reduce the amount of layers that need to be applied to get a nice opaque design. Using my number 4 Spectacular stencil, I can lift it up and look underneath. It will take at least 2 coats with the Adirondack paint, and with Snow White paint, probably about 3, maybe 4 layers to get a good coverage. Just want a nice soft design. While that's drying, I'm just taking a little bit of that Laurel and I'm tucking it against the ruffled edge of the lace. And I'm not doing it exact. I just want to create a shadow that lifts that lace off of the background. Kind of helps to separate it out. Because the colors I'm using today are all relatively on the soft, light side, a lot has to be created using contrast. And this is where this comes in. It just doesn't take much, just a little bit. And I did bring that across the bottom a little bit more. Loaded the toe of my brush with Snow White. Do not use the chalk paint for this because you want a very transparent, very filmy coverage, and I'm just mostly applying it to the tips and letting it blend out toward the bottom of the lace. And it looks a little darker than what it actually is. I have a great amount of moisture in my brush. The paint can be moved very easily, very quickly, and very smoothly. And I do blend it out well on my palette so that when I go to my piece, I can really work with it and play with it. Make sure that stenciling beneath is dry. And you can see how defined that wash becomes over that design of the stencil. Just wanted to increase the shading around the edge of the lace, and I'm using asphaltum to make that a little bit stronger. And look how much, it's just a little bit. It's very strong color, doesn't take much, but it really pops that lace out. Bringing it across the bottom because I want to create that vintage feel, just staying on the chisel edge of my angle to add those lines in the slats. I keep loading just a small amount on the tip of my brush. I could always go back and add a second coat, but it's so much easier just to put on a light coat and then go back and move it around. You can see how wet my brush is. I can encourage that paint more toward the where the edge of the boards kind of meet together. It's just such a soft hint, especially when that much moisture is added to the brush. It's just very little bit of paint, and see how easily I can move it around. A lot of water, a little bit of paint, just really encourage it. I like the way that asphaltum looks with the blue. It has a lot of green in it, so it just really coordinates well with that vintage look without becoming too heavy or too brown. Sometimes using brown on pastel colors makes it look kind of dirty. I'm just putting light hints of it, a little bit on the lace. Just think it warms it up, gives it that vintage effect with just a quiet, subtle hint of color. And I can always go back and add more, so I have a real light touch. I thought it would be pretty since I'm using a lot of pink. Picked up just a hint of wild berry, and I was surprised. I have just a very little bit on my brush, but it doesn't take much at all. It's just a really strong color. So I put out a big puddle of paint and used just a teeny tiny hint of it. I'm going to be using crystal blue as my surprise color, I guess is what I normally call it. So I wanted to add a hint of this crystal blue. It's a little bit stronger and brighter than the spa blue, so I can pop that in some of the shaded areas. It just brightens it up without reducing the effect of the shading. So if it does become too dark and heavy, I can pop that crystal blue in there, and it just that little bit of paint is quite amazing on what a difference it makes in the results. I did pick up some asphaltum with my splatter brush to very lightly splatter. I love the splatter brush. I have super good control, and I want those splatters to be more muted and not quite so heavy and solid, so I'm splattering, misting it with water. The distress sprayer is perfect for that. I thought I'd add a little bit of white to just lighten it. It's a great way to add an interest in the background without becoming too heavy. I did decide to go back and put another very, very, very light wash of Snow White on the tips of that lace, just to really make that stand out. That's kind of a fun little accent design, and I wanted it to be prominent. So this is just a hint. I didn't cover any of that shading up. I thought it would be fun to do something interesting to make the edges of the lace a little more frilly. I'm using the white Uniball pen. Basically, I'm scribbling, and I'm just taking my pen. You have to hold it straight up and down to get a nice application of the ink. You need to go slow. The pen won't write faster than the ink can flow down through the tip. So slow down, take your time, and I'm just doing maybe like a little figure 8 on the edge of that lace. Look how pretty that is. Going back to the strawberry, and I have it traced on, I'm just base coating it with vintage pink to give a nice solid base coat. And the chocolate part is sable brown. Really like using my number 5 radical round. It has a nice fat belly on it. Makes it really easy to apply the paint. When I press down, the tips spread out. It's almost like a filbert. And I have a couple go-to brushes. The radical rounds are definitely a brush I go to fill in areas that are maybe just have a little different shape to them, and I can just cover it easily and quickly. I didn't cover it too solid. I kind of played around, so you'll have to bear with me on this. I added a little drizzle of chocolate at the base of the strawberry. Later on, I decided I didn't like it and removed it. So I left it on there because it's going to show up. And if you like the way it looks, that's another alternative. Picking up a little asphaltum on the toe of my 1/2 inch awesome angle just to add some shading. And I'll add shading all around the outer edges. It's going to be heavier on the bottom and the right side. My light source is from the top and left, so adding just a touch on all sides makes it look a little more rounded. This is the same color I used for just the hint of a boost on the shading around the lace. So it pulls it all together. Picked up a little bit of watermelon slice to deepen the shading on the berry. Using plantation pine and my number 2 radical round. It's just a great little brush, has a nice fine point for those thin lines, and then I can use the push down and get a nice fat base, pull it out to a thin line. If you're interested in the complete step-by-step pattern, click on the link below. I have it available as a paper pattern, or you could also download it as an e-pattern. Adding just a little more shading on the berry, and I like to add my shading in layers. That way I can control the depth. I also think when you add shading in layers that it creates more of a glow or a 3D effect. I've loaded my diverse dry brush with cotton candy, wipe it on a paper towel, and then gently dry brush to get that really nice soft highlight glow. Doing the same thing on the chocolate with light mocha, and it's just super easy to add that glow, and it's much easier to do it before the icing stripes are painted. And I'm using vintage pink and my 18-aught, I'm using my number 2 radical round. Just stay up on the tip. It has a nice fine point. And just pulling some icing around, wrapping it around the chocolate. I'm using my number 2 radical round, and I kind of switch between the vintage pink and the wild berry depending on the tone underneath the strawberry to add those little pockets for the seeds. And it's just kind of a touch and a press to add those in there. And I'll go back later on to add the seeds, but right now I just want to kind of get those pockets in there. Deepen those in the shading with a little bit of watermelon slice. I've loaded my 18-aught script liner with cotton candy to highlight the top of that icing. Try to get a little more dimension on it. And I'm adding a little light mocha to that drip at the base. This is the asphaltum, and I'm just putting a little shade just right below where the icing lands on the chocolate. Create a nice little shadow there, especially with that highlight behind it. Really helps make it stand out. Kind of load the toe of my brush. I'm not really floating it sideways. If you like to float sideways, I would drop down to an 18 or an 1/8 inch angle. This is Snow White, and I'm just putting where the light is the brightest. Adding a touch of crystal blue down in the shading. Remember I said that was, well, this is Laguna, just a little bit of Laguna. It's going to just add another color, break up that brown. And it kind of amazing. It adds a subtle highlight on the shaded area, a little bit around the top, anywhere that it's just too solid. This really, you see what a difference it makes. Going back with a little more Snow White, really ramp up those highlights. Love how this is going. I think it's just really, really nice. I brightened up the highlights on the strawberry and back on the chocolate. Just took a little bit of Snow White and added a teeny tiny seed. Now I'm going back with the crystal blue to brighten up those highlights. And it doesn't sound like that would work well, but I just absolutely love the effect that this will achieve. Anywhere that it's just too solid or too heavy, this really lightens it up and adds just a hint of color, changes the whole atmosphere of the shadowing. Loaded my Epic script liner with Spa Blue just to kind of outline the edges, and it looks super, super bright, but it is, actually this is white, so it's, when it dries it'll be much softer. It's kind of the nature of white. Adding some little tiny lines in there for veins, it just adds that look of intricacy. A little bit on the top edge of that icing. Anywhere that it just needs some more brightness. Just a teeny tiny highlight on the seeds to brighten them up. Doesn't take much because it just adds that little bit of detail. Add a hint of pink on the leaves. Double loading my brush with cotton candy and watermelon slice or wild berry. Blend it on the palette and then just start swooping up and down and around to create those rose petals. I will say I'm not the best at painting roses, but this works really, really well. And I'm just putting little, and this is in real time, just little tiny swirls of paint. Keep the brightest color on the toe and the darkest color on the heel of the brush. After that is added in, I'm going back with a little bit of Snow White on my Epic script liner. Make sure it's very, very thin, and this is where you can start adding amazing detail. I'm just adding little half circles of white, and it fills that rose up. It looks like there's layers and layers and layers of petals. And it's super easy to take a weird looking rose and fill it in and make it look very soft and intricate. Using my number 6 Fabulous flat to put the leaves in. I was thinking I should have done the center vein first, or center branch first, but I go back and use my liner for that. Wasn't sure, this was the first one that I painted, so I wasn't real sure where the leaves, I wanted the leaves to go, but what is so nice, the paint is really thin, so if I don't like where they're at, I can just simply wipe it off. And you can see I removed that chocolate drip underneath, and it looks much better. This is Plantation Pine, which is a little bit on the translucent side, so it's not going to be a real heavy layer of paint, but I can go back and strengthen it. This is where I add those center branches and connect the leaves. And I'm just using my Epic script liner and a Plantation Pine. Picking up a little bit of that laurel, and I'm just kind of touching and pulling just to add a little more color to those leaves. Add a few little, I don't know, ghost leaves in the background. This is super thin paint, and it's really easy to add those hints of color, and you can see it's going to show up, especially up against that chocolate, and make it look like there's more there. Picked up Spa Blue, adding some highlights on the veins, the center branch, and look how that brings those leaves out. I'm going to add just a little bit around that one edge of the leaf. Make sure to give it a little bit of a curve. I think I had some weird things going on with my camera. It kept freezing, but you can see most of it, how I popped it in there. Anywhere that the leaves seem like they're a little bit lost or blend into the background, this little bitty tiny line can really help to define those and pull them out. If it doesn't show up, I'll go back and get plantation pine. So it's just a toggle. And every time you do a background, the blend of the background is going to be a little bit different. I did a set of 3. I did this strawberry, I did a cupcake, and then I also did a chocolate candy with a cherry on top. Every one of them, they go together really, really well, but each one is different in the background. I used this, put in the same kind of roses, just kind of so they would all not really match, but coordinate. And you can see how just those little tiny touches, it took like 5 seconds to do the leaves, but when you go back and add these little tiny details, that's what I call the wow factor. It's like really defines them, makes it look very intricate, makes it look like you spent hours and hours. I did not speed up any part of this video that you've seen so far. I did take out some of the dry time, added 3 or 4 little tiny dip dots in the center of the roses. And now that the paint has dried, I can go back and just highlight a few of those petal leaves or petals on the roses to make them really bright. But I think the total time it took to paint the ornament was around 45 minutes. So it really doesn't take long to do it because most of it is just kind of a quick wash of color and then you just keep building on it. This is a little bit of asphaltum. I wanted to add some shadowing below. I did trace on the letters and I'm using my 18-aught script liner to paint the wide sections, and then I bumped down to the 20-aught to do the skinny sections. And I am using the Adirondack white chalk paint because it is a thicker body paint, and I think I said this in the beginning, I can put less layers on to achieve a more opaque look. I don't think anybody's a fan of painting letters, so using the chalk paint really eliminates a couple layers of paint. So I'm going through just doing the wide parts of the letters, and then I'll switch brushes and do the skinny part. And I'll do this twice. I did speed this section up because it is very repetitive, using the 18-aught for the wider sections, the 20-aught for the smaller sections. One of the key things when doing lettering is to make sure that it is consistent. The vertical lines need to be vertical, and the little serif caps at the end of the letters need to be consistent. So if you angle one or angle all of them, just make sure that it makes sense. Keep those lines clean and smooth. I'm going in now with my 1/8 inch angle and laurel, adding a little bit of a drop shadow below and to the right of all sections of the letters. And I love doing this. I love to see how all of a sudden those plain painted letters just begin to pop out. And don't worry about getting shading on the other letters that you're shading against. If you need to go back and touch up some of the letters to clean up the shading, not a big deal. But wow, what a difference having the shading on there. And this is where it really begins to look dimensional and a little bit professional because it's starting to pop out. And it doesn't take much. I just have a hint of color. Now, as I get toward the bottom where the colors are a little bit stronger, I do bump it up a little bit. Remember, contrast is imperative. So if they start to blend in and you're not sure, just put one little float on, and it will be very obvious when you're finished if you need to go back and maybe ramp that up just a little bit. And I do take my time with the shading because I have such a small amount of paint on my brush. It really flows on very smoothly. If your paint brush starts to drag, you need a little more moisture on the brush. So I usually dip it in the water, lay it on a paper towel to pull out some of that moisture, blend it out on my palette, just picking up a little touch of paint. And I usually work from the side edge of the puddle of paint, and I usually go back into that same area each time to reload. I usually get a very consistent reload if I go to the same place to reload it, if that makes sense. I really like the way these colors work together. It's kind of a, well, it is a very different collection of colors than what I normally use in my palette. Not a big fan of pastel paintings. I like deep, rich, bold colors, so this was a little bit of a, not a struggle, but a challenge for me. So I encourage you, if you see something that you're not sure you can do, give it a try. You never know until you try. And what's the worst that can happen? If it doesn't turn out, at least you know you tried. And most of the time you'll impress yourself. And I was impressed with these colors. Let me know what you think, if you like the way this is going. Love to hear from you. If you do give it a try, post a picture. I would love to see it. And look how those letters are starting to just really bump out. When I got to this point, I thought it looked a little empty in the background, so I'm using my handy helper and my number 3 Spectacular stencil brush to stencil little hearts throughout the background. And I'm using vintage pink as the base coat. We had a power outage that I don't know what was going on, and my cameras kept going down. So this is the beginning of the hearts, and I went ahead and stenciled them on. After they were dry, I wanted to add a little dimension to the hearts, so I'm going in. You can use either wild berry or watermelon slice. I used wild berry and went back and darkened some of them with watermelon slice. I like to add just that little bit of extra pop that really kind of sets them off. And they're teeny tiny hearts. You can either stencil them or use a round to create them, or even a stylus. When you put the little touches on, to me that's what makes a big difference. And it's just a teeny touch of paint. After I added those on, I thought, you know, it needs one more thing, so I'm using my 20-aught script liner and Snow White. And I'm just putting a tiny, tiny common stroke on those hearts. And look how that really sweetens them up. I think that is so cute. They're in the background and they look nice, but adding that one more thing, it kind of like brings them to life. It makes them sparkle. And after I added these little common strokes on there, I thought it still needed just something else. I went back with my stylus to add a little bit of, I call this baby's breath, around my roses. And look how that brightens that up. It's all these little details. If you're not sure, try something. It'll either work or you wipe it off and go a different route. But what a difference that little bit of sparkle makes. And so I thought, well, I would add some little dip dots in the background, but I wanted them to be much more visible, so I went with a bigger end of my stylus and a bigger dip dot, and it just makes it look like a sweet party in the background. Everything I used is listed in the links below. Be sure to check out my signature brushes. I guarantee they're going to make your painting life a lot easier, and you'll be impressed with the quality and the performance. I love how this turned out, and I hope you enjoyed it as well. Be sure to give me a thumbs up, hit subscribe, and share with your friends. Thank you again for joining me. I look forward to our next painting adventure together. And remember, a little bit of paint makes a big difference.